clearly.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that, but I do want to start with your prologue because
Mhm.
the book opens briefly with October 7, but it actually very quickly shifts into Nat Turner's 1831 slave revolt. And despite ordering his followers to kill all white people, he's now revered as an American freedom fighter, which you also talk about. You ask, before he stands condemned, mustn't it be asked except to live and die in thraldom? What alternative did Nat Turner have? You also mentioned at the time, revered white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison expressed horror over the events that took place, but blamed the white slave owning
Correct.
population, saying, "We have warned our countrymen of the danger of persisting in their unrighteous conduct." I've also utilized the Nat Turner rebellion example when referencing October 7. You have as well. I've seen your interactions on Piers Morgan, which is, an interesting affair. We can talk about that later as well. But I wanted to hear, do you view yourself as a modern day equivalent of the white abolitionist after writing about the Zionist oppression of Palestine for over 4 decades now? And obviously, you're probably a little too humble to answer that in a similar manner. But what other warnings have been ignored that you've been ringing the alarm bells on?
First of all, one has to acknowledge one's precursors, and one has to acknowledge one's current collaborators. There have been many people. It's still a small number, but there's still a number. My precursors were people like Noam Chomsky, Israel Shahar from the country Israel, Edward Said. They came before me, and in many ways, I learned from them both their steadfastness and also their mental powers, their dedication, their conscientiousness. I would say now I've entered the age where they're gone. They're not on the scene anymore. And so the mantle has, so to speak, with the baton has been passed to me. I don't believe I had any great powers of prediction. A lot of my analysis since October 7th, I believe, has been borne out. But in general, those who predicted that if Israel continued with the occupation, it was going to be a dramatic deterioration in Israeli society. There was a fellow, I suspect you've never even heard of him, Yeshayahu Leibovich, and he was Israel's great philosopher. He had 4 PhDs, really smart guy. And he, along with a certain number of others, said as early as 1967, this occupation is going to be a complete disaster. That if you don't end it, Israel, he coined the phrase, by the way, Yeshayahu Leibovich, who was the most revered intellectual in Israel. He coined the phrase, Israel's turning into a country of Judeo-Nazis.
People will say that term actually originated from David Duke sometimes.
No.
What's
David Duke was not bright enough to originate it.
So what's interesting on that point that you just mentioned is one of the examples that I often use is the horror in reaction to the Deir Yassin massacre from the likes of Albert Einstein, who has gone back and forth and has a more complex, I think, experience with Zionism and what it turned into. But his commitment to binationalism and living alongside peacefully with the Jewish and the Palestinian population was very clear. And he is the example that I usually go to, which is really interesting because The Atlantic actually wrote a whole article on me deploying the Albert Einstein example, saying that this was actually wrong, that Albert Einstein was a huge Zionist and loves Israel, and I was lying about his background. Are you familiar with some of the things that Einstein has said about?
I've read his writings. I have to say I'm a bit of a skeptic about the possibilities of coexistence
We're going to get to that as well.
between the Jews and the indigenous Arab population, because there was such a sense of contempt for Arabs, Muslims, the indigenous population, and such a sense of a double kind of superiority by the Jewish settlers. There was the superiority of being European.
Yeah.
And then that was compounded, or you might say determined, by the sense of Jews feeling superior. That sense of superiority born of a certain notion of Jews being chosen people. And then there was just the sense of the backwardness of the Arab Muslim community in general. So when you fill out the historical picture, the probability of a real coexistence among equals, I think, was not really very plausible. There were some individuals who weren't bad. The first head of the Hebrew University, a fellow named Judah Magnus, I think he was a pretty decent fellow so far as I can tell reading his stuff, but I don't think it was really very possible. I think the most honest formulation came from now a right-wing Israeli historian. He wasn't always right-wing, Benny Morris,
who you've had the pleasure of debating.
Yeah, he said that the idea of transfer is the euphemism for expulsion.
Mm-hmm.
He said the idea of transfer was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. I think that's a more honest reckoning
Mm-hmm.
of where things stood back then. So I'm not a believer that there was a real possibility of coexistence, though it's never been. It's certainly got much uglier in recent years. You could say the ugliness is either more honesty or, the expression that hypocrisy is the compliment that vice pays to virtue. The older generation, they weren't so in your face. You mentioned Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin he would be considered now. He would be considered now the far left in Israel.
Yeah.
He would.
But
during his first term of office, he was elected in 1977. When you know what one of his first acts was? He abolished torture. Israel was practicing torture against Palestinian detainees from right after the 1967 war. Now this guy, Begin was...
He's too woke for Israel now.
Exactly. Begin was a lawyer by training, and he was a stickler about the law. And he knew torture was illegal. So he did abolish it. I mean, nowadays, you couldn't even imagine that. It's not even conceivable.
Nowadays, the only time that Israel ever prosecutes any war criminals in their ranks is when they intercept the communications of ICC prosecutors in an effort to utilize the complementarity principle against the ICC to act as though they are doing a mock trial, basically, to hopefully stop the ICC from further prosecuting their war crimes, which again we'll talk about. I wanted to continue in the epilogue.
I want to just return to the Nat Turner analogy. Just as a matter of background, when October 7th first happened, the first couple of days, I don't know if you remember.
Oh, I remember.
Right. The first couple of days, it just looked like a prison breakout.
Yeah.
And they said about 50 people were killed. And, 50 people, that's not even the blink of an eye. So I immediately made my sentiments known that I supported.
I also remember that.
The prison breakout. And I had no qualms about it, no compunction. But then it became clear that something much bigger happened. When something much bigger happened, it was not, it was hard to try to think it through, to figure out, well, where do I stand? Probably on the order of 1,200 people were killed. I would say the evidence is pretty clear. About 850 were civilians.
Yeah.
And of those 850 civilians, as of now, I've read all the available material, overwhelmingly were killed by Palestinian militants.
Yeah.
So that's a large number. You can't get around that. That's a large number. When Sabra and Shatila happened in 1982, the massacre in Lebanon, the initial numbers that came out, they turned out to be low. The initial numbers that came out were about 800 Palestinians were slaughtered in Sabra and Shatila. In fact, it was probably closer to 2,000. But even when 800 came out, that was considered a very large number.
Yeah.
And then if you're from Egypt, when Sisi came to power, he committed the massacre at Rabbah Square with the nonviolent protesters. And the estimate by Human Rights Watch was about 1,000 were killed. And was seen as it was the largest single massacre in Egyptian history. So that seemed a large number.
Yeah.
And now I'm faced with about 850 civilians killed on October 7th. And what do you do with it? What do you do with it? Now, under normal circumstances, namely for the last 40 years, I don't say this with pride, I'm just saying it factually. I normally would have consulted Professor Chomsky. I considered his moral judgment, if not impeccable, near impeccable, and I usually deferred to his moral judgment. But he wasn't available. And I was sweating for around a week because I knew a lot of people were going to want to know what I think. And I was torn. I was torn between the fact that I knew from having spent about the last 20 years, I knew what had been done to the people of Gaza. I knew the details, the horror of what those folks endured. On the other hand, there was a mass slaughter. And what do you do with it? And I thought, I walked the streets trying to figure this out. And it happened that the last book I had written was on wokeness, and I had read a lot about the abolitionists. And I had read, of course, about Nat Turner. So I turned to Nat Turner, The Rebellion, and I said, you know what? Roughly, it's about the same thing. What the slaves endured was not much different. Gaza from 1948, when it was under Egyptian rule, from 1948, it was repeatedly described as a concentration camp by outside visitors. Even the extreme right wing, head of Israel's National Security Council, Giora Eiland, who's still among us. He was one of the advisors during the Gaza genocide. He described in 2004, Gaza as a concentration camp. He said it's a huge concentration camp. So now I knew what they had endured. I knew there had been a massacre, a slaughter of significant dimensions. And then what do you do with it? I saw Nat Turner rebellion seem more or less analogous. The first order, kill all white people. And that's what they proceeded to do. They went from house to house, smashed the skulls of women, killed men. Even in this case, they did behead babies. Not on October 7th, but during the Nat Turner rebellion. So now I have the analogy, but then there's a second step. You got the analogy, where do you stand on it? And I thought the right place to look were the abolitionists. They were of sublime moral character. They were courageous, they were consistent, and they were very smart. You don't get people smarter than Charles Sumner, Frederick Douglass. they were really impressive. And when I went back to read their writings, what became very clear was they would not condemn Nat Turner.
Yeah.
They would not. They condemned the white system that forced Nat Turner to do what he did, that the coercive system that created Nat Turner. And then I felt, okay, if I'm wrong, then the white abolitionists and black abolitionists, they're wrong.
Including Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass is an interesting case.
Yeah.
Because the abolitionists were against violence.
Yeah.
They believed in what they called moral suasion. But Douglass described Nat Turner as one of our glorious martyrs, one of our revolutionary fathers. Same thing, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
They all acclaim Nat Turner. And what's also interesting is the black people at the time, they did not condemn Nat Turner. They were
Nat.
Exactly.
Well, I know that from your book.
Yeah, he came to occupy a place in African American folklore, and he became a folk hero. They would refer to him as, quote, Old Nat's War. Old Nat's War. Because they understood whatever the methods, whatever the horrors, and as you quoted William Lloyd Garrison, he recognized horrors occurred. But where did it come from ultimately? What was its deep source? Its deep source was the desire for freedom, the struggle for human dignity. Maybe it was wrongly expressed, but there's another question. What option did they have? What option, if you're speaking honestly, what option did the people of Gaza have? They tried diplomacy. They tried international law. They tried nonviolent civil resistance. They tried everything. And it was all a dead end. And as you probably remember, by October 6, 2023, the only game in town was, would the Saudis join the Abraham Accords?
Yeah.
Gaza had been forgotten. Well, and then the rest is, so to speak, to quote the cliche, the rest is history.
Yeah. So going into this analogy a little bit further, because you brought up the fact that binationalism was destined to fail from the start, given the supremacist attitudes from early Zionists, doubly supremacist considering that there is the European colonialism aspect to it, but then also Jewish supremacy directly. I agree with that, but we live in the United States of America, which is
You're totally right.
a country that is objectively white supremacist in its fundamentals, and yet we now live in a country that has obviously a very complex history and still continues to struggle with offering any kind of real restitution to Black Americans. And yet I always go back to that same comparison about the end of the abolition of the apartheid. And that is what that is part of the reason why I present the one state solution and, forcible reintegration of everyone, including the oppressed and the oppressor, living side by side in a, secular solitary state as the true North Star. Now, of course, what's more important from my perspective is how the Palestinians feel about that. And there is not that big of a commitment to a one state solution. I think for the most part, historically, it's always been a two-state solution. There are additional complications that come along with that. But if we're just simply talking about the morality of it or maybe even pie in the sky idealism, the reason why I believe in the abolition of the occupation and the apartheid, with, of course, reparations offered to the Palestinians, a right to return and everything else, not dissimilar to what Avi Shalem has also talked about, is because I'm an American citizen. And if it can happen here, and although there are still many issues, I think the contemporary Black experience is probably better than the current experience of a Palestinian, both in the West Bank and certainly in Gaza as well. So I feel like that is a path towards progress. It would require tremendous amounts of outside pressure from not only the international community, specifically the United States of America, American Jews as well, with connections back to Israel, familial connections. But that is what I believe. You're saying that is not possible because Zionist fascism is far too powerful of